7 o'clock, so we're going to start. All right, so with us not having class last week, I made adjustments to the schedule, as you can see. So from the 2:26 all the way through 3:26, this is what I'm hoping we're going to finish. Tonight, I'm hoping to get 15, 16, 17, and 18 done, and then so on and so on. If we need to do some catch-ups, I think maybe the week of 3:19 might be a good catch-up week. So we'll find out when we get there. All right, let's go ahead and start with prayer. Father, we humble ourselves before you, expressing gratitude for another day you've given to us. We are grateful for an opportunity to study your word. Help us to open our minds to the words of Moses as he is attempting to encourage the children of Israel, knowing he will no longer be with them and no longer be able to guide them. This is our prayer in your Son's name. Amen. All right, and I forgot the clicker. Okay, so last time we left off with chapter 14. The most relevant, point of chapter 14 was from verse 22 down through the end of the chapter. We introduced a second tithe. This tithe is one that you keep yourself, and it is supposed to be utilized when you go to the place God says to go and you're going to be worshiping him. The caveat under that in verse 28 of chapter 14 is that every third year you give that to whoever needs it. The way it's described as you bring it and you put it up inside of your town, and whoever doesn't have their own provisions are able to take it and worship before the Lord. So that was introduced. We're going to come back to this idea in chapter 16, probably again later, but I know for sure in chapter 16. Okay, any questions left over from last 2 weeks ago? Who can even remember what we did 2 weeks ago? It's probably in my favor, because then you don't have any questions. Okay, so chapter 15. The first 6 verses introduces us to the concept of the entire chapter, and that is every 7 years a release is to occur. So we might call it the sabbatical year. Sometimes it's referenced to that. It's not the year of Jubilee. That's year 50. So this is every 7. Year of Jubilee is strange because that's 2 in a row. So in the first 6 verses, it starts talking about this. In verse 2, it says, "This is the manner of the release. Every creditor shall release what he has lent to his neighbor." It is fascinating. Now, other ancient sources and ancient codes do have this idea of every few years there's a purge. All debts are gone, all things are released, but not the way the Jews do it. So they've got Code of Hammurabi has a slave release date of every 3 years you have to release your slaves. And then they've also got I don't want to, and they've got provisions in that as well. But this concept of all debts everywhere are just gone. So if Doug borrows some money from me, we're both Jews, so I have to give him, and I cannot exact interest. Now, if it's, let's say, year 3 of the 7 years, he has 4 more years to pay me back. We make an agreement. This is how much he's going to be paying when he can. But maybe we had some hard years. Doug's not able to pay it, and we only get maybe half of it paid off. When we hit year 7, that debt goes away. He's not going to be paying me anymore. I'm not allowed to ask him anymore. I'm not allowed to bring it up ever again. It is gone as if it did not exist. So there's some unspoken faith concepts here. Why are the Jews able to give freely to each other and every 7 years just say, well, you don't have to pay me back? Why can they do that? Because God will provide. So this is another one of those moments where they have to step back and say, I have faith that God will take care of it. So every 7 years, these debts are forgiven. Because what is the goal of all of the Jews? What is their primary goal when they're in the land? to be equal with each other. Everybody has their plots of land. Everybody has their food. Nobody is truly rising above or falling below, but it's about creating an equality. Paul uses similar concepts when he talks about giving in the New Testament. He says, don't give so much that you yourself now have to receive, because that's not the goal. The goal is not the giving. The goal is equality, that we can all live okay lives. That's it. That's the purpose. Now, what if I'm a Jew and I lend to Ben, but Ben, he's an Assyrian? Do I have to forgive his debt? No. And I could charge him interest. Yes. So, in verse 2, not exacted from neighbor. Verse 3, of a foreigner you can exact it, but if it is yours and it's with your brother, your hand releases. Now, let's move away from money ideas. I gave my neighbor 3 oxen. He's supposed to pay me for them. Well, it's the 7th year, the oxen are gone. They're not mine anymore. So it doesn't just have to be money. There is one caveat, and that is land. Land ultimately will revert. So if I loan Doug, let's say, 7 acres, and he's supposed to be paying rent on this, at the end of 7 years, an argument could be made in front of the judges that this is now mine, you have to release it. When would it then revert back to me? This is not in this section of Deuteronomy, it's a little Leviticus. Year of Jubilee. Every 50 years, all property, excluding inside of a walled city, because inside of a walled city, everything gets all weird. But this is ancestral property. Every 50 years goes back to their ancestral family. Doesn't matter who bought it, doesn't matter where it is, it automatically goes back. Because again, the goal is not to increase wealth. The goal is to everybody to live comfortably, to live okay lives, to not be in need, to not be in want, but instead to feel the blessings of God. So, that's verse 1 through verse 6. Any questions, any thoughts? So it introduces an idea. Now we have to add a secondary idea. And that's people like to be angry about things. And so 7 through 11, I called it the open hand. Okay, Jake comes up and he says, you know what, I really need a lot of money, and it's year 6. Ugh. Well, I'm a good Jew, so I'm going to give it to him. I'm never going to see it again. He's not going to pay any of it. Oh, it's just the worst. Or I'm going to say, can you wait a year? Then we'll do it when it's year 1. So 7 through 11, if among you one of your brothers becomes poor in any of your towns, do not harden your heart or shut your hand against your brother, but open it and lend him sufficient for his need, whatever it may be. Take care lest there be an unworthy thought in your heart and you say, the 7th year, the year of release is near, and your eye looks grudgingly on your poor brother, and you give him nothing. And he cries to the Lord against you, and you be guilty of sin. So the heart matters here. You shall give to him freely. Your heart shall not be grudging when you give to him, because for this the Lord your God will bless you in all of your work and in all of your undertaking. There will never cease to be poor in the land. Therefore I command you, you shall open wide your hand to your brother, to the needy, to the poor in your land. Can you hear Paul's arguments about the collections in the New Testament here? The idea of he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. The idea of give freely, not under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. That's anchored in Deuteronomy. It's a concept that the Jews would have been very familiar with, that the Gentiles would probably have never heard of in their life. And you bring the two of them together in Christianity, and Paul says, I need to explain some things. You are supposed to be giving. If you are not giving, it is sinful. But you're not supposed to be giving because it's a compulsion, but you are required. However, you're supposed to do it cheerfully because you choose to. Did you guys follow that one? It was a complex idea for a Gentile mind. To the Jews, it made sense. You're my brother. We want all equality. That makes sense. They didn't like it, and they don't do it a lot, but it makes sense. Okay, any questions, any thoughts on that? Because there's a third problem that we now have to add in at the end here with this 7-day release. Thanks, Jake. I'd lend to you. Okay, the last one is, what if somebody sells themselves to me as a slave? Now, we don't like slaves in America, blah, blah, blah. Slaves are fine here. Notice how God organizes this. If your brother, a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, is sold to you, he'll serve you 6 years. In the 7th year, you let him go free. When you let him go free from you, you shall not let him go empty-handed. You furnish him liberally out of your flock, out of your threshing floor, out of your winepress, as the Lord your God has blessed you. You shall give to him. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore, I command you this day. Okay. Rule number 1 is every 7th year, all slaves that are Hebrews go free. Foreigners, you can keep them. Typically, you get foreigners by going to war with them, and these are the ones who didn't die. In the ancient world, if you didn't die in battle, you were still considered to be dead. So you could be taken as a slave because you're a dead person. You have no more rights. You don't exist any longer. Ancient world mentality. So this is the principle. If it's a Hebrew, he's worked for you. He's worked nicely for you. You have treated him kindly. Therefore, when he goes out from you, you reward it. You give to him liberally from your flock, your threshing floor, your winepress. You do not let him go empty-handed. What is the purpose of a Hebrew selling himself to another Hebrew? It's the same purpose of I'm lending to a Hebrew and not exacting interest. We're all supposed to be equal. There's going to come times when, look, it's just me. I got no land. I'm the 7th kid. My land is taken. I need something. I can't function. So I'm going to go to a wealthier landowner and I'm going to sell myself and say, buy me, which then means he has to provide for me. He has to provide shelter. He has to provide clothing. He has to provide food. And there's even some provisions, especially through Leviticus and Numbers, of giving wages. They're less, but there still is wages, because I have rights. I'm a Hebrew. And on that 7th year, I am set free, and I reap the rewards of what I have done. Does that remind you of one of the patriarchs? Who? Jacob. How long did he sell himself to Laban for? 7 years. What did he get out of the 7 years? Fruit of his labors. A lot of headache. Then he had another 7 years. This is not a coincidence, right? We're not talking about an isolated event. This is a pretty common Middle Eastern practice at this time. So Jacob follows the same pattern. We're seeing it exactly the same. Okay. Any questions or comments on that before we add the second half of the slave issue? Yes. Yes. What did it say in Leviticus? Oh, you're making me remember. If you give him a wife, she remains owned. So if he is released, you still own her. But the children are free. I think that's Leviticus. Or it could be the other way around. So if the wife is given a husband and so forth and so on, you still own. Because it happens within. If it happens previously, you don't own. They're a unit. They are their thing. Yes? Cool. Put some gum in it. Technically, yeah. Potentially, it could also be assuming that they made a different, it's not relevant. I don't need all 7. So we're not making a long-term arrangement, we're making a short-term arrangement. So if I make a short-term arrangement with you and we're going to end that before the 7 years is up, so it's year 2 through year 4, and in the middle of that you give me a Hebrew wife, that rule would then come in. Yeah. Because this is not the only way you can do it. It's not just a max of 7 years. I mean, you could, or a minimum of 7 years. You could do a 1-year slave arrangement as well. The Greeks will call it indentured servitude, and we would use that term in our modern world as well. Cool. So the next wrinkle is, what if the slave likes you and doesn't want to go away? Oh, isn't it terrible when you got people living in your house and they don't want to leave? Oh. So what happens? I know, I thought you guys would like that one. So what happens? He's been with me for years. He likes it here. She's been with me for years. She's got a family here. She just doesn't want to go anywhere because it's not a bad lot. I mean, really what we're looking at is perhaps similar to medieval serfdom. I have a lord. I am the servant. I'm just going to stay here because, you know what, my gig is not that bad. I got to do stuff, I got to work, but they're really nice to me. So God says, all right, there are going to be times when it is most appropriate for the slave not to leave. So God says in verse 16, he says, I will not go out because he loves you and your household since he's well off with you. You shall take an awl, put it through his ear into the door, and he shall be your slave forever. So to your female slave you shall do the same. It shall not seem hard to you when you let go free of them. For at half the cost of a hired worker he has served you 6 years. So the Lord your God will bless you in all that you do. So that half the cost of a hired worker is the idea of I'm going to pay somebody to come live with me. I provide them room and board. I also provide them full wage. He doesn't get full wage. You've saved money, so give to him, and give to him liberally. So the idea is I don't want to leave, so we're going to do something incredibly permanent. It doesn't have to be, like this nice little hole in the ear. I mean, there's some records of it. They just drive the awl straight through, and you have this massive gaping hole in your ear that never goes away. So it's obvious. Your ear is mangled as a result of this. So everybody knows, but it's also a good thing because you don't want to go anywhere. It's a blessing in the eyes of everybody else because what does that say about your master? He's good. It's going to increase the likelihood other slaves are going to come to him and say, buy me. Let me be yours. Because he's got a whole bunch of holy-eared people. Pun. Therefore, more are going to want to come. Increases his wealth, increases his standing. He is helpful. He is continuing to provide for the poor. And he's going to make more having access to a labor force than he would not have otherwise. So there's a lot of benefits to it. This also, the idea of an awl driven through the ear, is not isolated to the Jews. Even in Canaan, there is one myth where Baal makes himself a servant to the god Yam, the god of the sea, the big serpent. And he drives a hole through his ear so that he will permanently be a slave to Yam from that point forward. So it's not fully isolated, but God is codifying it for the Jews. This is a good idea. We are going to be doing it. All right, any thoughts on chapter 15? Yes. What is an awl? What's it used in? Wool? Oh, for punching leather. That's why I'm thinking wool. It's cloth. It's a massive metal instrument that you hit and punch through leather with. He still belongs to the family. Yeah, so he would pass down with inheritance, like most possessions would. Good question. Yeah? Huh? Yes. Yep, all. Whole and ear. So there's not a, no, you're going to stay another 7. It's all or nothing. Very good, very good. I like that. Yes. That may be true. That may be true. I mean, it's protection for the slave, too. Imagine that you work for a disreputable master. And so he goes and he tells everybody, oh, they just want to stay another 7 years. And then you're stuck and you're trapped and you cannot get out because everybody knows you've been there 7 years. It's time. No, the whole comes in or you go. All right, anything else before we finish off 15? Because I forgot there's a little bit more. Okay, last one is the firstborns of herd and flock. All firstborn males that are born of the herd of the flock are dedicated to the Lord. You do no work with them. You do not shear the firstborn. You shall eat it, you and your household, before the Lord your God, year by year, at the place that the Lord will choose. So what that means is you could include it in the chapter 14 secondary tithe. You got a whole bunch of firstborns that can count in your secondary tithe. As long as there's no blemish, they're not lame, they're not blind, there's no serious blemish of any kind, because then it can't be part of the worship, the sacrifice to the Lord. Instead, you eat that in your towns. Unclean and clean can eat it. It's irrelevant to God. Only you shall not eat its blood. You pour it out on the ground like water. So, principle is, I got a firstborn cow, but it came out all mangled. I can eat it and treat it however I want. It's done. I still can't work with it. I still can't shear it. I don't know why you'd shear a cow, but anyways. But I can eat it. Anybody can eat it. I can kill it for whoever I want to. Chapter 14 also has some of those principles in it. All right, any comments anybody has before we talk about 16? I'm okay with on time right now. I'm only like 7 minutes behind what I need to be. Okay, chapter 16 has 3 feasts. Why are these 3 feasts most important? We're going to learn that in verses 16 and 17. And then we end with starting the discussion about judgment. Judgment is going to go into chapter 17, into chapter 18. Really, it goes quite a bit. We talk about how to make righteous judgment. So in chapter 16, we start with these feasts. First feast is Passover. What is Passover? Yes, it's the commemoration of the leaving of Egypt, when God passed over and didn't kill the firstborn. There's our nice word play. So we're given the month of Abib. Keep the Passover in this month. Remember what's going on. Offer the Passover sacrifice to the Lord from the flock or the herd. God doesn't care, but it has to meet the certain qualifications out of Leviticus. We're not going to go into that because of time. No leaven will be anywhere. This is the first great purge of leaven of the year. We are purging leaven out of everything. It's not in our house bread. The bread of affliction for you came out of the land of Egypt. 7 days of unleavened bread. Alternatively, 7 days of unleavened bread ends in sacrifice. Which one is correct? It depends on which Jewish rabbi you talk to and which century we're in, because the Jews are going to argue about that since God said this. They still argue today. In fact, during the time of Jesus, whether the decrease of leaven comes first, culminating in a Passover feast, or in his 3 years of ministry that he does the opposite. So he typically goes that way. That's the way I think. Any comments? Or you can ignore it the rest of your life and you'll probably be fine. Okay. The sacrifice of the Passover has to be eaten the same evening, and none of it can remain until morning. How do I ensure none of it remains until morning? What are my options? Share it, so make sure you pick a small cow, or you bring people over. It's really supposed to be a you bring people over. That's really where it's at. But if anything is left, it is burned in the morning. Nothing is to remain of this. All right, in 6 of chapter 16, it says you don't just eat it in your towns, verse 5, but instead you eat it at the place that the Lord your God will choose. And then we establish a permanent. David does that. Where is the permanent that David establishes? Jerusalem, yeah. So he brings it there. He builds a tabernacle. Ark of the Covenant arrives. Starts off at Shiloh. It's in Shechem for a little while. During the days of Saul, it kind of vanishes for a bit, and then reappears during the days of David. So that is where you go. Verses 16 and 17, let's go ahead and bring it in because we're going to talk about it again with weeks. We're going to talk about it again with booths. Feast of Booths. They shall not appear before the Lord empty-handed. Every man shall give as he is able, according to the blessing of the Lord your God. I have saved another tenth. This is what I am utilizing in the worship of the Lord. So Passover becomes Feast of Unleavened Bread. Notice that change. Passover is an event followed. If you are too sick, you could be excused. So there's going to be some provisions for if you miss a feast, how do you make up a feast? Most of that is going to land on Day of Atonement, but there's going to still be a little bit in here. Okay, other than that, there's really no other excuse. Like the excuse of, I just gotten married, it's a big one. I have just gotten married, which means that I'm excluded from all war actions for a year. Sometimes the Jews will extend that into I'm excused of all risky behavior. Traveling the roads, I don't see that, but you may see that when you're looking at other writings and such. Okay, any comments before we get into the next feast? Day, Pentecost, is feast day. Begin your count. The 7 weeks from the time the sickle is first put to the standing grain, which to us means nothing. So codified, it's pretty well just after Passover. They're ultimately going to say, day after Passover, start counting. That's really what they're going to do. In verse 10 it says, then you shall keep the Feast of Weeks to the Lord your God with the tribute to a free will offering from your hand, which you shall give as the Lord your God blesses you. That's another reference to the chapter 14 tithe. You shall rejoice before the Lord your God, you and your son and your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, the Levite who is within your towns, the sojourner, the fatherless, the widow, who are among you at the place that the Lord your God will choose to make his name dwell there. You shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt. You shall be careful to observe these statutes. So this one becomes a problem. 50 days separates Passover and now the Feast of Weeks. Pentecost, Feast of First Fruits, gets called a lot of things. How far can I go in 50 days? So if I got to get all the way down to Jerusalem, and I live way up in the north of Dan area, right up there towards Syria, it's probably going to take me about a week of travel. So I'm there, I'm stuck for 7 days after Passover because I'm not traveling during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. I get back home, I'm home for maybe 20 days, 25 days, and then I'm packing up and I'm heading back down to make sure that I have enough time to make it arrive and set up to be prepared for Feast of Booths. So what do you think ultimately is going to happen here? People are going to stay. Yeah. Those who come the farthest are going to wind up staying. By the time that we get to the time of Christ, almost universally, all Jews come, they stay the 50 days, like they just do. So a massive number of Jews are going to be there, and many of them are going to be poor people because all of their funds are now gone by the time that we get to the day of first fruits, Pentecost. Which population does Christianity thrive the most in, the wealthy or the poor? The poor. The poor flock to Christ. So which feast does God decide, all right, we're going to start the church? The one when you got the most amount of poor people, Pentecost. He doesn't start it with Passover. Passover's the sacrifice. He starts it when all of their funds are gone, when they have no longer any reason to be in Jerusalem. They don't have to come back to Jerusalem for months. They're going home. That is when God begins. So again, I like how he sets this up. It's pretty fascinating to me. Okay, any questions or comments on Feast of Weeks? All right, next one. Feast of Booths. When does the Feast of Booths take place? takes place right after which other one? The Day of Atonement. I think it's cool. God's our Feast of Weeks. All right, this is the beginning of harvest. We have harvested, we're rejoicing. Many people are just staying for the two of them. And then, Day of Atonement. Oh, by the way, now we're going to do Feast of Booths. You have to be here for Feast of Booths. You have to be here for Day of Atonement as well. It's a Sabbath-style rest. It's a day of mourning. And then the Feast of Booths is a week of rejoicing. So, we come before the Lord on Day of Atonement. We humble ourselves. Everything becomes purged and purified before the Lord. We offer all of the sacrifices. Everything becomes consecrated, and then 7 days of rejoicing. Yes? I think it's 2 to 3. It's close. But no, not between Day of Atonement and Feast of Booths. Those are the same. In the 7th month. They should be, yeah. Because you should have Day of Trumpets, 7th month, first day. Day of Atonement should be 12th or 15th. And Feast of Booths would happen after. So, I mean, there may be a couple of days in between, but it's supposed to be pretty quick. Okay. Any other questions or thoughts? Cool. Unless you can find me a verse that I'm forgetting about. Because, I mean, I don't like their calendar. It confuses me, and so I just give up. Okay. So verses 16 and 17 we've already looked at. 18 through 20. So let's start the discussion of judgment. So we've got our festivals. We know we're not supposed to have foreign gods or foreign religions. We know we're supposed to worship only one God. We know all of those things. So now, how do we establish a system of judgment to rule us? So the beginning discussion is judges and officers. The second discussion is going to be kings, and then we're going to get into Levites and priests. A little bit of Levites and priests before kings, but ultimately they come mostly afterwards. So in verse 18, you shall appoint judges and officers in all of your towns that the Lord your God is giving you, according to your tribes, and they shall judge the people with righteous judgment. You shall not pervert justice. You shall not show partiality. You shall not accept a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and subverts the cause of the righteous. Justice and only justice you shall follow, that you may live and inherit the land that the Lord your God is giving you. So, we're establishing judges, we're establishing officers. They are supposed to be inside of your towns, and they are supposed to judge. It's built off of how God spoke to Moses. Moses says, I can't handle it. We establish other judges. We've already talked about how they're supposed to be righteous and they're going to fail and all of that. We talked about that at the beginning. Okay, any questions or thoughts on that? So this is the introduction to the new subject. He then says in verse 21, you shall not plant any tree or any tree as an Asherah besides the altar of the Lord your God that you shall make, and you shall not set up a pillar which the Lord your God hates. Why is he saying this right here in the middle of judgment? Because it was not uncommon for judges in Canaan to be found under the tree. When we get to the book of Judges and we find Deborah, she is identified as a prophetess found beneath the tree. At best, she is mirroring what is commonly seen in the land. At worst, it's an Asherah. You're going to find people that argue on both sides of that. You're going to find people that are going to argue that she's righteous, God approves of her, therefore it can't be an Asherah. You're going to find people that also argue that, almost worse, and God approves of him and utilizes him. So just because you are unrighteous doesn't mean God's not going to choose and make you into a judge. I mean, look what happens with Gideon. Gideon does a bunch of stuff, but the entire time he questions God, he doesn't like God, he doesn't want to do it, he tries to get out of it, then he establishes an idol worship inside of his own town. So just because God picked you as a judge doesn't necessarily make you righteous. But I want you to see that connection. You'll see that imagery in a lot of the prophets as well. When they come for wisdom, they come for prophecy, they go to the tree. You'll see that imagery rather than going to God. So I think that's why it's here. Several scholars agreed, several did not. Some think it's just inserted and it has nothing at all to do with anything else, but that seems dumb to me, so I don't listen to that one. The pillar is an Asherah. So maypole might be a good modern equivalent. The idea of we're going to erect a pole, we're going to decorate the pole, has its roots in paganism, has its roots in this is the representation of our idol. Asherahs are poles, ultimately. They call them trees, planting a tree in a garden. They use other terminology, and it may have been a literal tree, but it's designed to look like a pole. So several times we're going to see that. Gideon goes and burns his father's Asherah, tears down the pole, then ultimately sets up his own idol, which is strange. I don't think it was his intention, but he sure does it. So makes an ephod, wasn't told to, puts it up as a decoration. Like, it's a whole thing. We're not talking about Judges, we're talking about Deuteronomy. Okay, but that's what the pole is. Anything else? 17. What do I do if I have to kill somebody? So they have committed evil. Verse 2. Man or woman, they have done evil in the sight of God in transgressing the covenant. They've gone and served other gods. They've worshipped them. They worship the sun, the moon, host of heaven, anything that has been forbidden. Like this is, I have done the evil, or they have done the evil, and we have inquired. We know they've done it. So we bring them to the gates. Verse 5. You bring them to the gates and you stone them. The witnesses start. How many witnesses are required? Between 2 and 3. What that means is, I saw it, I make it known, we investigate. So it doesn't have to be, well, I saw Michael out there worshiping Baal, but I was alone when I saw him, so I can never talk about it. That's not what this is. This is, I saw it, I know what I saw. So therefore, I go tell people that they investigate so that we get more witnesses. So it doesn't have to be you were at the event, but you did the investigating. Those that are willing to say, yes, this has occurred, are the ones to throw the first stones, followed by everybody else. Any comments, any thoughts on that? Establishes a safety principle. We got to be sure. Also establishes a responsibility principle. Sometimes people are mean to each other and they lie about each other, but there's a big difference in I'm going to lie about you and I'm going to hit you in the head with a rock designed to break your skull. Those are different. Some people are going to be willing to do both. The vast majority of us are not. Most people are just not killers. They're not murderers. They might be willing to do defense. They might be willing to gossip. They might be willing to slander and cut you down. But when it comes to holding a rock and throwing it at you is a very different event. Okay. So then we can step up from this. General principle has been established. We brought in judges. Evil has been found. Witnesses are done. The events take place at the gate. Gate is really popular. We're going to see it a lot. We're going to see judges waiting at gates. We're going to see kings waiting at gates. That's the whole problem with David and Absalom, is Absalom goes to the gate. He acts as a judge and then steals the heart of the people. So if somebody comes to Jerusalem and says, I want the king's opinion, they find his son there instead at the gate. David's up in the palace. It takes a long time to get to him. You got to wait in a long line. You just had to walk in. You can talk to Absalom. Wins the hearts. The gates are where judgment is taking place. So, add the second layer in. This is a really hard case. We need someone to help us. So you've got a judge out there in Naphtali. And it's a long way from Jerusalem. They're doing the best that they can, but they come across something that just we need help with. So God says in verse 8, if any case arises requiring decision between one kind of homicide and another, one kind of legal right and another, one kind of assault and another, any case within your towns that's too difficult for you, you shall rise and go up to the place that the Lord your God will choose. Let's use an example of this. Michael and I went out in the field. Michael didn't come back. I say he fell and hit his head. Other people say, no, I killed him. How do we know the difference? There's a law for that. But your local judge may not feel confident enough to say, this is my decision, because he's probably related to a lot of people involved. Remember, your towns, especially in the province areas, the far provincial areas, are going to be mostly family units. And for him to say one way or the other is going to have ramifications in his life. So what he can do is say, I need to go and ask. So all of you at that point, it says at the end of verse 8, you shall arise and go up to the place the Lord your God will choose. You shall come to the Levitical priests, to the judge who is in office in those days, and you shall consult them. They shall declare to you the decision, then you shall do according to what they declare to you from that place that the Lord will choose. You shall be careful to do according to all that they direct you, according to all of the instructions that they give to you, according to the decision which they pronounce to you, you shall do. You shall not turn aside from the verdict that they declare to you, either to the right hand or to the left. The man who acts presumptuously by not obeying the priest who stands to minister there before the Lord your God, or the judge, that man shall die. You shall purge the evil from Israel. All the people shall hear and fear and not act presumptuously again. We ended verse 7 with, you shall purge the evil from your midst. We end with verse 12, you shall purge the evil from Israel. This is too hard for me. Rape cases. It happens in the field, there's one regulation. It happens in town, there's another regulation. What if it happens during a really loud event, but it was in town? I mean, it's in town. They should both die, right? I mean, can you hear the hem and the haw there? We need help. You go to the Levites, they are the ones who decide. Then, what if the Levite in charge says, no, sorry, happened in town. I don't think she did it. I don't think it was her fault. I think all of those kind of things. I think it was just bad. No, kill them both. Happened in a town. Some judges will say, okay, it was really loud. There were extenuating circumstances. Because there is a doubt, we're going to use the field regulations instead of the town regulations, because I don't really know. That's why you go. So if you're going to the judge hoping for one answer and get another answer, you no longer have a say. I am the judge of my town, I have all say. But if I appeal and I go to a higher court, I no longer have a response. They are the ones who give it. So this is kind of why we see in the New Testament that if your brother has something against you, you go take care of it. Don't drag him before the judge. Because us together, we can do whatever we want within reason. But if we go to a judge, the judge can make a decree and I no longer have an answer. So here today, if we have issues with each other, we go to each other. But if I go to my elder, like the advice I got, no, it's I'm disobedient to my elder now. That is a different class. I have appealed higher. So notice how Paul is setting that up, how God is setting it up in the New Testament. It's the same as we have here in Deuteronomy. Any thoughts? It's the whole reason, Corinthians, when he says, don't take each other to court, don't you have people amongst you that can decide? Why are we going to Gentiles? Who are they to us? Well, for one, they have a lot of authority, and we like to ignore the elders' authority sometimes, because it's a lot easier because they're super nice, and they don't tend to stab you with swords. Romans do. So we're going to listen to the Romans, we're not going to listen to the eldership, and then you have a congregation that falls apart. All right, any thoughts before we go a little further? Yeah. Yes. functionally, like the way the words are used, totem pole is a North American concept, where you are more connecting with spirits than gods, because it's a different style religion. Asherah is a specific goddess, and she is represented by the pole, typically decorated, garlanded, that kind of stuff. I mean, Christmas tree, again, is North Europe. It's not exactly a one-to-one comparison, but it has some similarities. Yeah. Yeah. It's a hard concept because to us, when we think of an idol, we think of Greece. Greece's idols are people. I have a statue of Athena, I have a statue of Zeus. They look like people. But when we're looking at this time period, especially in Mesopotamia and Canaan, they don't look like people. It wasn't uncommon for Baal to be represented just by this oblong rock. That's it. Household gods typically were about a foot long and oblong. They're just rocks. And so this one's Baal, this one is Yam, this one is Molech. Those are my household gods. Now, we're used to the Roman or the Greek ideal where they're actually sculpted statues of humanoid beings. Or we're used to an Egyptian idea where they're actual sculpted statues. But in Canaan and Mesopotamia, that region, they weren't always. Even stealing a god from one place. There's accounts of Assyria and Babylon having wars and conquering a city and stealing their god. Many times all it was a big stone, but that's our god. That's the one. Sometimes it's well sculpted. Many times, especially during Deuteronomy's age, it's not. The well sculpteds are coming later. So some of that is just getting away from our Mediterranean concept of idolatry and moving towards more of a representative idolatry rather than a true image. That answer? Hey, no, totally fine with me. All right. So we are in 17. We're going to continue with verse 14 next time and continue on down, hopefully getting a little bit further than we did last time. So if anybody needs it, there's the hope for next week. Thanks, everybody.